Tonight, Mr. President, I came to the floor to talk about, not yet, to talk about a decision that came out of the Department of Interior the day before Christmas Eve. This is a decision that, in my view, is absolutely unconscionable. And it's a decision that was made by the Secretary of the Interior the afternoon of December 23rd, in which she rejected a medical emergency connector road between two very remote Alaskan communities, between the community of King Cove and Cold Bay. And Mr. President, I have thought long and hard about my public comments to my colleagues here in the Senate, because I've spoken out about this at home, and I was very direct. I was very direct about my anger, my disappointment, my frustration. And I recognize that I've got to work with folks in this administration, and when we're talking about the Secretary of Interior, I recognize she's effectively Alaska's landlord. I need to be able to figure out a way to get along with her, but I have to tell you, Mr. President, this was absolutely a heartless decision by Secretary Jewell. It was a decision that she alone made, and it will only serve to endanger the Alaska Native Village residents of King Cove. With the decision that the Secretary made, she has put the interests of certain environmental groups and the alleged peace and comfort of the birds, the waterfowl in the Eisenbeck National Wildlife Refuge above the lives of hundreds of Alaskans. 950 Alaskans live in King Cove. And by the Secretary's act, by denying this short road needed to ensure the people of King Cove reliable and safe access to an all-weather airport in nearby Cold Bay, Secretary Jewell has effectively turned her back on the Aleut people of Western Alaska. She has discarded her duty to uphold the trust responsibility that the federal government owes to its Native peoples. And Mr. President, your uncle served as Secretary of the Interior. He knows full well that trust responsibility. It is a high trust. And the Secretary has turned her back to the Native people out in King Cove. And to add insult to what could very well be real injury or even death, Secretary Jewell did this on the day before Christmas Eve. On the day before Christmas Eve, I receive a voicemail message from the Secretary telling me that she, later in that afternoon, is going to deny the road to King Cove. What was I doing? I was doing the exact same thing that most of the people that were around me were. We were last minute getting ready for Christmas. I was in the parking lot of the Fred Meyer parking lot, going inside to get Scotch tape and wrapping paper. Mr. President, the decision that was made by the Secretary is one that goes beyond building a 10-mile, one-lane gravel, non-commercial use road between King Cove and Cold Bay. This decision makes clear to us in Alaska that our lives, the lives of the people, the human beings that are there, just don't seem to matter to the Secretary. It's clear to me that either she does not understand or she does not care about the most basic needs of our remote residents, and it's quite clear that we have once again received unfair treatment at the hands of our federal government. Sometimes it just feels like those on the outside, whether it's the federal government back here, 4,000 miles away from home, that there's this sense that Alaskans need to be protected from themselves. Well, quite honestly, that's offensive. And quite frankly, I have a very hard time believing that if this same situation occurred somewhere in the lower 48, that the decision would be the same. The fact of the matter is we're out of sight, we're out of mind. There's only 720,000 people in Alaska. There's only 950 people or thereabouts in King Cove. Who's going to be upset? Well, I'm upset. I'm upset. Not only have the people of King Cove been wronged, but the people of Alaska have been wronged. This was not a decision that is going to just go away because we all got caught up in the Christmas holidays. This is not going to be something that the people of Alaska or that this senator will forget, because we are not done. Now, I've been to this floor many times, and in fact, I think, Mr. President, you have been in the chair on previous occasions when I have come to call attention to this life-saving road and the land exchange that was approved by Congress, signed into law by the President. And I feel like I've told this story so many times that I don't need to remind folks, but I'm going to provide a brief refresher. The recent story of King Cove actually started pretty well. Congress came together almost 5 years ago to give the Interior Secretary reason and authority to act in the public interest when it came to providing access. But as is so often the case, this has become yet another terrible example of the interests of our people put at risk by their own federal government. So back in 2009, I had introduced legislation. We passed legislation that proposed to add more than 56,000 acres of state and tribal land to the Eisenbeck Refuge in exchange for a 206-acre road corridor through a corner of the refuge. Again, I want to repeat the numbers because some people say you must have forgotten a zero in this exchange. In exchange of 56,000 acres of state and tribal land in exchange for 206-acre road corridor. And in addition to the fact that this is basically a 300-to-1 exchange that was offered, there was agreement that this road would be so limited as to have an infinitesimally small impact on the refuge. Because the people of King Cove are not insensitive to the fact that this is a very rich ecosystem out there. This is a very rich area. This is where the birds do come through. So they've got no interest in harming or damaging the refuge. And so the agreement was a one-lane, between 10 and 11 mile long gravel road, severely restricted by law, not just an agreement that the mayor says, oh, during my tenure, we're not going to use it for commercial purposes. No, this is in law. Non-commercial purposes, one lane, 11 mile long gravel road. And in addition, there were going to be roping or corridors so that if you were on the road, if your vehicle was on the road, you wouldn't be able to go off the road and onto the refuge and put tire marks or impact the refuge at all. The Department of Interior's own EIS clearly showed that the actual acreage inside the refuge to be impacted by fill material was just around 2.7 acres. So again, think about the exchange. They're giving up 56,000 acres in exchange for a 206-acre road corridor, and of that, the impact by fill material is just about 2.7 acres. So consider also that the exchange would have added 2,300 acres of eelgrass beds to the refuge. Now, this is prime habitat and feed for the black brant, and this was something that clearly Secretary Jewell felt was very valuable, because she chose to place higher value on those black brant than she did on human and wildlife values. That 2,300 acres, then, is about 20 times more than the eelgrass that the EIS said might have been impacted by erosion as a result of the road. So the rejection of this exchange just dumbfounds me. I don't understand it. The state of Alaska and the local tribal groups were willing to give up 56,000 acres of land. And keep in mind, Mr. President, these are lands that were given to them under the Native Land Claims Settlement Act. These lands are who they are, and they're willing to give up 56,000 acres of it for a lousy, one-lane, gravel, 11-mile, non-commercial use road. That's how much this road meant to them. Because it was more than a road. It was a life-saving connector. It was a way for them to get to an all-weather airport, the second longest runway in the state of Alaska that was built during World War II, an amazing runway, actually, that isn't encumbered by the topography and the weather as the King Cove airport is. So you have a people who are desperate for a solution, so desperate for their solution that they are willing to give up their lands, the most prized thing that the Native people have in our state, are the lands around them, and they're willing to exchange them for a small road corridor, a 300-to-1 exchange. And the proposed land that would have been provided to the federal government is pristine land that's valuable for the waterfowl, for the wildlife, certainly would enhance and benefit the refuge. But Secretary Jewell said no to this. She said no to this 300-to-1 exchange, and an exchange that would enhance the habitat for the birds that she wants to protect. It really makes you wonder, has there ever been such a lopsided land exchange that's been rejected by the federal government? The former head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Dale Hall, he was the one that largely picked the lands and had approved of this exchange back in 2006, long before this legislation was ever even introduced. So the federal agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service, had looked at all this and said, okay, well, in order to get this corridor, there's going to have to be some exchange. So let's figure out what it's going to be. And he gave his blessing to that back in 2006. But what this does speak to is how strongly Alaskans feel about protecting the health and safety of our residents, and rightly so. And I would submit to you, Mr. President, that if Secretary Jewell and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service truly had the best interests of both the human residents and the birds of the Eisenbeck Refuge in mind, they would have recognized that adding 56,000 acres while taking out just 206 acres, and then again of that, the amount that would have actually been impacted by fill is 2.7 acres. I think that they would provide far greater benefit to the refuge than any small, single-lane, gravel, non-commercial road ever possibly could subtract. The legislation directed U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to conduct an EIS for the road. So the 2009 legislation that passed the House, that passed the Senate, that was signed into law by the President, directed Fish and Wildlife to conduct an EIS. That agency prepared a faulty EIS. They failed to adhere to the underlying law, choosing a no-action alternative and failing to adequately account for health and human safety when selecting the preferred alternative. This is more evidence of systematic disregard for the well-being of the Aleut who have lived in this region for thousands of years. Now, Mr. President, I also want to touch very briefly upon Interior's trust responsibility to Alaska Native peoples. The Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Kevin Washburn, went to King Cove. He visited, he actually spent 2 days there. In fact, they actually had some pretty stinky weather when he was there, and I think he saw firsthand what the residents of King Cove deal with in getting in and out. The Assistant Secretary wrote a report for Secretary Jewell. It was not made public until after the Secretary announced her decision, which I think was unfortunate. But again, back to the trust responsibility, the responsibility that the federal government has to protect the health and safety of Native Americans. But here, you've got the Fish and Wildlife Service, you've got Assistant Secretary Washburn, and now finally Secretary Jewell, who had the opportunity to encourage or actually make a decision that would improve the lives of the residents of King Cove, and they turned their backs on these people, and they diminished the hopes of these First Peoples. The EIS, which recommended no action to help the people of King Cove, has a clear negative impact on the health and safety of Alaska Natives that live in that village. The report, the official report that was prepared by Mr. Washburn regarding his visit to King Cove, I believe was inadequate, wholly inadequate, and quite frankly, very weak. He, as the Assistant Secretary, is viewed as a leading legal scholar on Native trust responsibility. I truly have high hopes for him because I believe that his heart clearly is in that right place, but his report falls woefully short of his duty to the Aleut people. And I expected more of him, truly I did. And I know that the people of King Cove deserve better. The health and safety of the people of King Cove is not some speculative issue. We're not just talking about, oh, the weather's bad, somebody might get hurt. The fact of the matter is, Mr. President, that since 1980, 18 people have died, and they've died because of medevac delays or because of the dangers connected with the medevac flights out of the fishing village. It's not easy to get in and out of King Cove. They've got an airstrip, yeah they do, but they sit right between, they're surrounded on 3 sides by mountains and a valley on one and the ocean on another. The Coast Guard describes medevacs into King Cove as one of the more frightening, more challenging operations that the Coast Guard is tasked to do. And you might say, well, why is the Coast Guard doing medevacs? Well, because medevac flights from Anchorage, some 600 miles away, can't get in. They say the risk to us to fly in with somebody who is in the midst of a difficult labor and needs to get out to the nearest hospital, which is Anchorage, 600 miles away, it's too great, or we're not willing to risk our lives. So who do you call? You call the Coast Guard. In 2012, the Coast Guard was called in, I believe, 4 times at the cost of $22,000 to the taxpayers to bring in a crew to medevac that individual out. So if you can fly in If the Coast Guard is able to do it, they will be there. But in the meantime, you've had people die, you've had planes crash. And if you can't get out, the alternative, because there is no road, there's no 10-mile, one-lane gravel, non-commercial use connector road, you can go across the water. Well, think about it, Mr. President. If the weather's bad enough up in the air, think about what it's doing down in that ocean. It's pretty tough. And so you can come across the water 4 hours in 15, 20-foot seas. But then once you get over to Cold Bay, it's not like they can just load you onto a nice, into a nice airplane on the runway there. You gotta get docked and up off the dock to get to the airport. Well, can you hold that up a little bit? You know, the fact of the matter is King Cove, Cold Bay, a little bit rustic out there. What you see here, and it's probably difficult to see, this is the top of the dock at night. This is about a 20-foot drop to the ocean here. You have metal ladders that you climb up if you are able. But if you are able, you probably don't need to be medevaced out. A person in a heart condition, how is he climbing up this metal ladder as the waves are crashing against you in the dark and in the wind? What you're seeing here is basically a sled that has been hoisted up on a crane, swinging around in the wind, in the dark. I don't have the picture here of the elder who had suffered a heart condition and could not make it up the steps. They could not hoist him up. They put him in a crab pot and hauled him up by crane onto the top of the dock so that they could then take him to the airport, where he was safely evacuated out and made it to Anchorage. But Mr. President, as I say, when we're talking about the health and safety of the people of King Cove, it's not speculative. People are dying. People have died. People are afraid to fly. The testimony that the Secretary heard, that my colleagues have heard, as the people of King Cove have come back, they've said, enough. The Secretary, in her visit to King Cove in August, stood before the school children there at an assembly. And she's very good with children, and it was good to watch the exchange. But those children spoke up to her and told her why they needed a road out of King Cove. And to hear a child say, we need a road so that I'm not afraid to fly because I don't want anyone to die. Mr. President, this is an issue, again, that the stories that we have heard, that the Secretary has heard, because I was there with her. We heard the stories together. They are heart-wrenching. They bring tears to your eyes. The people, the families that have lived with this have been devastated. And the Secretary heard all this. And yet, it seems that she has just chosen to ignore the voices of those children, the stories of those elders, the pictures of an elder being hauled up in a crab pot so he can make a medevac to Anchorage. Mr. President, I want my colleagues to know here in this Senate, as well as the administration, that I am not going to let this issue die. And there's a simple reason why. Because I am not willing to let anyone in King Cove suffer or die because they do not have emergency access out of their village. This decision rested squarely on the shoulders of Secretary Jewell, who then announced this devastating news only hours before Christmas Eve. A heartless decision delivered at a heartless time. Now, the Secretary said to me that there's no good time to deliver bad news, and I would agree. But the timing of this decision was solely hers. There was no deadline within which she had to act. She chose to announce it on Monday afternoon at 3 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, knowing that everyone was going to be skating out of here for the holidays, hoping that everyone was going to be distracted with their family events, hoping that no one was going to be watching. She knew that the people of King Cove would be upset. She knew that I would be upset. But it's less than 1,000 people, she thinks. Well, Mr. President, that's just not how you do things. It is just not how you do things. The people of King Cove are without hope right now for one reason, and that's because of this decision from the Secretary. And I've come here to tell the Senate what happened to them in what was supposed to be a season of joy and celebration. And I truthfully cannot use strong enough words to show the depth of my anger for this decision. I can't fathom why she came to it, why she was willing to sign her name to it. But I, for one, never thought that we would see a day where, under the guise of making a public interest determination, a cabinet secretary would so blatantly disregard the public's health and safety. But we have. And so the question now is, does it stand? Are we going to do what we know is right and make sure that those who live in King Cove are protected? Well, I have my answer. I am going to stand in solidarity with the people of King Cove and others in Alaska and across the country whose well-being is put at risk by misguided government decisions devoid of proper balance between human and wildlife considerations. Now, I have not yet identified every opportunity that I may have to draw attention to resist and seek redress from Secretary Jewell's bad decision. Now, an obvious and perhaps an easy step would be to introduce yet another bill. But I'm not willing to concede that the last word has been spoken on the law that we enacted in 2009. That law passed after a great deal of effort. There was debate, there was significant compromise, as I have outlined. But that was a law that we had all negotiated, and I don't believe that that law has been properly implemented. And who knows how and whether the courts might address that injustice. A messaging bill might get some attention, but you know, I'm concerned that its immediate consequence may be to legitimize, in the eyes of many, a bad decision that we should be fighting rather than accepting. And I think that the people of King Cove deserve better. Mr. President, the Department of Interior needs more balance. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service needs better direction. I'm not ruling out any possible remedy. In this case, Alaskans have been made the victims, but I think that all Americans are at risk from this kind of unbalanced decision-making, and I pledge to my colleagues and my constituents that I'm going to keep fighting for what is right, both morally and legally. This fight is not over. And again, Mr. President, the attention is drawn to the residents of King Cove and a small connector road in a very remote part of our country. But I do think it is emblematic of the bigger struggle, the bigger fight that we are seeing as a state with our own agencies, with our own federal government. So I've taken a great deal of time this evening. I appreciate the President's attention as I have made my words and made my case. I'm certain that the administration is listening to my words as well. As I indicated at the outset, in Alaska, we have no choice but to figure out how we deal with our agencies because they occupy so much of how we're even able to move forward as a state. I will continue to do what I can to work with this administration in a manner that's going to benefit the people that I work for. But I will always, always put the health and safety and best interests of Alaskans